In this unit, we will compare and contrast two different periods of the prehistoric occupation of the eastern United States. We'll first look at the woodland period, when people cultivated indigenous domesticates but still relied heavily upon wild plants and animals, and we'll compare this with the later Mississippian people, who were intensive corn agriculturalists. We'll look at differences in the size and density of their population, and how this was related to changes in social organization. First, we're going to look at eastern woodland cultures, sometimes referred to as the Adena and Hopewell, other times just referred to as woodland. They are also known as the mound builders for the prehistoric burial mounds that they built, and they're well known for the finely crafted objects that are found in these prehistoric burial mounds, including ones that are made out of copper, like the cutout bird in the lower left, and some that are made out of mica, like the raptor claw that's in the upper right. Woodland cultures refer to those groups in eastern North America that practiced a mixed economy of foraging and cultivation. They manufactured pottery, and they constructed burial mounds and other types of earthworks associated with these mounds. Their subsistence economy integrated both foraging and cultivation, and the plants that they cultivated were domesticated varieties of sunflower, marsh elder, goosefoot, and squash. These were all indigenous domesticate. They also hunted, fished, and gathered different types of plants, including nuts that were particularly important. Pottery revolutionized the cooking of food and the storage of it. Early woodland pottery is not particularly attractive to look at, but it provided a new way to cook foods. Foods could be boiled for long periods of time, and certain foods this allowed them to maximize the nutrition that could be drawn from it. It also allowed foods to be stored in a safer context, ones that would not allow rodents or insects or other vermin to infest and potentially destroy seeds that were being stored not just to eat, but seeds that were being stored to plant the next spring. And they cultivated a variety of indigenous domesticates, plants that were domesticated in the eastern woodlands, and these included marsh elder, sunflower, squash, maygrass, knotweed, and little barley. And we talked about marsh elder in the domestication unit, and maygrass, knotweed, and little barley are similar small-seeded plants that were used. These were almost all dropped from the suite of plants that were cultivated after the introduction of corn. Sunflowers and squash continued to be cultivated. Sunflower perhaps for its importance as an oil-bearing seed. These small-seeded plants also required a considerable amount of post-harvesting processing costs, sorting the chaff out from the seeds in order to be able to consume the seeds alone, the chaff being that various leaf-like material that encloses the seeds and holds them onto the stalks. And to sort the small seeds out from all of the chaff was very labor-intensive and additional processing cost. Further, these small-seeded plants were not all that productive when compared to the later introduced corn, which produced greatly more calories per acres in terms of the amount of food that it produced. You were introduced to the concept of life zones in the Foraging in the Southwest unit, and in the eastern United States there are also different life zones with different combinations of plants and animals in different areas, but there's even greater diversity, and it's more than just differences in elevation. There are also differences in the types of soils and proximity to water, and primarily the aspect of a slope, not just its elevation. Is it an east-facing or south-facing slope that receives more direct sunshine and accumulates more heat through the day? Or is it a north-facing or west-facing slope that receives less direct sunshine and accumulates less heat and actually retains more water through the day? These differences lead to different microenvironments. with different types of plants and animals available. And here in this view we can see a variety of little microenvironments available, like the meadow in the foreground that has a small pond in the very front center. And then there are different types of plants, trees, and shrubs in the forest as you move upwards in slope. And so along this slope, at the foot of the slope, there will be different types of trees and shrubs than you would find as you move up the slope and at the top of the ridge. And on the other side, where it has a different exposure to the sun, it's going to have a different composition of plants. And so there's a lot of variability in very close distances. One of the most important resources that woodland peoples used were hickory nuts, which, like piñon nuts in the Southwest, are very important because of their protein and fat content, as well as their ability to be stored for long periods of time. And hickory nuts, like piñon nuts in the Southwest, grow on trees that go through those cycles of high productivity, where they try to produce more nuts than the various predators in the environment, not just people, but various animals, squirrels, deer, wild turkey, all of whom want to consume the hickory nuts and prevent them from going down into the ground, germinating and creating the next generation of hickory trees. So every few years, 3 to 5 years, different stands of hickory trees produce vast amounts of nuts. And like with the piñon trees, you can monitor that in the spring, looking at the blossoming and the emerging nuts, and determine where you would focus your efforts of harvesting hickory nuts in those areas where they're most productive each fall. Hickory nuts have an outer hull that then encloses the hard nut, and within the hard nut there's the soft nut meat. And if anybody has eaten a hickory nut, they're kind of similar in their internal structure to walnuts. There's a lot of complex nut structure as well as the strange shape of how the meat fits in, and you might need a little pick in order to extract them after you've cracked them up. Or you could do what woodland people sometimes did. They just crushed the whole nut up, put them in pots, and boiled them. That would also allow them to separate the shells out from the meat, but mainly it was in order to separate the oils, which was then skimmed off and contained separately. This hickory nut oil was an essential condiment. It was the ketchup or sriracha of prehistoric eastern woodland peoples, and also of historic woodland peoples. It would be served with every meal. You would dip various breads in it, dip meat in it as a sauce. And while we are trying to cut the excess fats out of our diets, prehistoric people often were trying to maximize the amount of fats. Fats is an essential nutrient. We are just getting too much of the bad types of fats in the diets that we eat today. But prehistoric people, often eating very carbohydrate-rich vegetable diets, often needed to maximize the amount of fat that they were consuming. And so nut oils were a way of doing this. And where near gathering hickory nuts, you'd probably encounter wild turkeys that were also after hickory nuts to consume, as well as deer, who also eat nuts in the fall. And remember that deer are important not just as a source of meat, but also as a source of a variety of other materials that were very useful and needed. Their hides was the largest animal to provide the largest hide to use for manufacturing leather. The antlers and bones could be turned into tools. The sinews, the connective tissues, particularly those that run along the length of the back, were used as fibers to create bowstrings or to sew with. You could boil down the hooves for glue. There are a lot of uses that the deer could be put to other than just producing meat. Another very important resource were aquatic resources, particularly fish, and particularly fish of the family Catostomidae, the downward-facing mouth in Latin, or suckers. Now these fish in their life cycle live most of their lives in the main streams of the rivers, but during the springs they migrate up smaller streams, similar to the way that salmon move upstream from the ocean. They're going upstream to clear, shallow, fast-moving water over gravel beds where they will deposit their eggs, and they'll be fertilized there. And while they're on this upward journey, there are certain places along the streams where they may become concentrated in numbers as they're trying to go over rapids or up small waterfalls. So these create reliable, predictable, and highly productive resources that can be used every spring. Now these suckers range from the white sucker in the upper left, it's about 18 inches to 2 feet long and may weigh 2 to 3 pounds, to the black buffalo at the lower right, which is up to 40 inches long and weighing up to 40 pounds. Fish could be caught in traps, which are like large funnel-shaped baskets placed between rocks or other obstacles that the fish swim into and then become trapped. Or they also used fish poisons. If the fish were congregating in large numbers in a pool below a low waterfall, there were certain plants that could be used to create a poison. These poisons, usually made from the inner bark of walnut trees, affected the fish's ability to absorb oxygen from the water through its lungs. The fish literally asphyxiate and drown in the water. They do not affect the people. They do not poison the meat or cause any ill harm to the people who consume the fish later. Woodland cultures were not one uniform culture, but rather different groups across the region that were unified through exchange networks that were used to obtain exotic raw materials that were then used to manufacture ritual objects, and also similar uses of iconography, artistic representations of supernaturals and deities, and also of architectural cosmology, the construction of mounds in a particular way to represent a concept of how the universe was organized. Woodland cultures are divided into two broad time periods: early woodland, which is sometimes referred to as Adena, and Adena more specifically refers to woodland peoples of southern Ohio and northern Kentucky. Early woodland is from 1000 to 2000 BC. They are more mobile than later woodland people, and perhaps more dependent upon foraging. They built smaller burial mounds and associated earthworks. The late woodland, sometimes referred to as Hopewell, and Hopewell very specifically refers to that same area of southern Ohio as Adena does, but there are different Hopewell, as you can see in this map, the Ohio Hopewell in orange, but also the Havana Hopewell to the west in Illinois, the Trempealeau Hopewell to the north in Wisconsin, and other groups like Copena and Swift Creek in the south, all of whom shared the same iconography that seemed to be representations of their conception of supernaturals like deities and the way that the universe was organized and the place of humans within the universe, and they also exchanged among each other in order to gain access to resources like mica from the southern Appalachians, marine shell from the Gulf of Mexico, copper from the western Great Lakes. Later woodland, from 200 BC to AD 400, seems to have more emphasis on agriculture and greater sedentism of communities. They built large and elaborate burial mounds and associated earthworks that enclosed them, and the exchange networks became even more widespread to collect materials from as far away as the Great Plains and Yellowstone in the Rocky Mountains. More is known about Hopewell funerary rites, their construction and use of burial mounds, and the associated artistic traditions, the production of the types of artifacts that are found within these burial mounds, than everyday domestic life. And this is because the history of archaeology in the region has focused on these large, easily found and documented burial mounds. Also, woodland households were not in large aggregated villages. Instead, they were scattered across the landscape in small homesteads of 2 to 4 houses that were occupied for maybe a generation at a time. So they are very small and dispersed archaeological sites, not concentrated in large, easy to find. Also, these small sites are not as well preserved in many cases. They are in the same areas that modern people have lived and used for agriculture and also developed into large communities. So they are not as well preserved and not as easily located as the large burial mounds, which stand well above the landscape and are easily observed. From what we know about woodland households, and there's increasing amount of information accumulating through cultural resource management archaeology, something that we will see again with the Hohokam. Archaeology is being done in order to comply with cultural preservation laws. They're trying to preserve archaeological sites, and if archaeological sites are going to be damaged by development, require mitigation, excavation of the sites to collect data before they are destroyed. And much of the area in the eastern woodlands where people would have lived prehistorically has been disturbed by farming and other modern developments. This map shows a segment of the Scioto River Valley in south-central Ohio. The Scioto River runs north-south, beginning just north of Columbus in the center of the state, and southwards to the Ohio River. Along it, there are many late woodland enclosures with associated burial mounds, 3 of which are shown at scale on this map. You can see these large rectangles and circles, some of which are up to a ½ kilometer in diameter or along one side, and they seem to be relatively evenly spaced along the valley, about 4.5 to 5 kilometers apart. And in between are these dispersed little homesteads of 1 to 2 houses, one of which is Brown's Bottom No. 1, which was first explored in the 1960s and has been revisited by an archaeological field school from Case Western Reserve University. Brown's Bottom No. 1 is located in an agricultural field that is used for the cultivation of corn and soybeans. Here we can see the students and staff have moved out of the site as a plane flies over in order to take aerial photos. So you can see the areas that have been excavated and controlled 1 by 1 meter units, expanded, connected in order to expose a large house floor. Each of those white dots that are arranged in a large rectangle represents a post hole, an upright post set into the soil in order to form the walls of the structure. Hopewell houses are large, rectangular to square structures that have one large room within them. These were used to house probably extended families, not just a single nuclear family, but an extended family, perhaps brothers and their wives and children, and the parents above, and perhaps a few grandchildren may be starting to run around. But these are large social units, large cooperative social units that work together in order to cultivate the land and also to collect wild plants and hunt and fish. This is an artist's reconstruction of a Hopewell homestead. The houses have walls that are made of wattle and daub. Those upright posts would then have other smaller saplings interwoven horizontally between them, and those would then be plastered over with mud and plaster to create the sealed walls. The roofs are made either of a thatched grass, as we see in this example, but in other areas, planks of bark stripped from trees would be used. A lot of activities occurred outside. We can see a large fire where many of the meals would likely be prepared. In some seasons, you wouldn't want to have many fires inside because it would build up too much heat during the summer. So a lot of activities occurred outside where not only is there more air, fresh air, there's also more sunlight. The interiors were not subdivided, and were about 12 meters by 12 meters, or maybe about 35 feet, so just under 1,000 square feet. My house here in Mesa is a 2-bedroom house, and it is 980 square feet, but it's subdivided into 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, a living room, a kitchen, a pantry. And these do not have any subdivisions within them. They're one large room that is jointly used by probably a large extended family. Late woodland pottery differs from early woodland pottery in the forms. It doesn't have the pointy conical forms that the earlier vessels had, have a more rounded globular form. The cooking jar walls become thinner over time, and this has been suggested to have allowed more effective cooking of seed-based porridges, allowing them to convert many of the carbohydrates into more easily digestible forms that provided more nutrients to those who consumed them. But most obvious, however, is the vessels decorated through cord marking, indenting, incising, and applique. Cord marking is where you take a stick, wrap a cord around that, and then you would impress that into the clay before you fired it. Incising is where you incise designs within, and on this vessel you can see a combination of incising to create the sort of U-shaped scale-like design, and then cord marking, the sort of parallel horizontal lines that are placed within those scale-like designs. Applique is where you add little raised areas of clay onto the surface once you've created the pot. And there were some finely made types that may have been not used on an everyday basis, but made specifically as offerings and burials. In this sample of late woodland pots, you can see not just cord marking and sizing, but applique with those little knobs that have been added, and also stamping, where there are stamps made with the design that can be used to repeat the same design over and over across the pot's surface. Now, the variability in these designs can reflect variation in time, as designs change over time in the same production location, or they may represent production in different areas by groups with different concepts of how to decorate pots, and were expressing their own identity through the decoration of pots and distinguishing themselves from their neighbors who decorated pots differently. So this variation allows archaeologists to look at changes over time and assign sites to particular time periods. It can also be used to look at exchange relationships between different regions. So what to remember? Woodland refers to not one uniform culture, but groups across the eastern U.S. that were unified by exchange and ritual practice. These groups cultivated indigenous domesticates, but were still heavily dependent upon foraging, hunting, and fishing. Woodland households were not in large villages, but rather were dispersed across the landscape in small homesteads of 2 to 4 houses. Pottery revolutionized cooking and storage, and it provides archaeologists information on when sites were occupied and exchange relations between different regions.